So I don't like microphones. I'm pretty loud. I shouldn't need it in a group this small. So hopefully, if I'm not loud enough, let me know, but I really don't think that's going to be a problem. If you have your Bible, open it up to Matthew 12. We're going to be from there today. And while you're doing that, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. Some of you may know, some of you may not know, but my degree was in youth ministry and adolescent studies. So what that means is that I went to school to be a pastor, but not just any pastor. I went to school to be a pastor that works with teenagers. So, and over the years, I've got to do that a lot. So I've done a lot of actual teaching to teenagers, and we always talk about, the 12, 13, 14-year-olds, how they're kind of squirrely. I don't know if you know what that means. I don't know how many squirrels there are in Sophia, but I haven't seen a lot of them. But it just means they're like really crazy and kind of all over the place, And then you get, into the high school and kind of that 9th through 12th grade, and it's like they're beginning to develop into these really rich adults, and you can have these amazing conversations with them, and I love doing that. Recently, as some of you know, I've gotten kind of a different teaching experience with teenagers. I've started to teach at my kids' school. Last year, I spent a semester teaching church history, and actually this year, I'm going to spend a whole year teaching 2 more Bible classes. I'm teaching a Bible survey class, which is basically we're just going through and doing a general overview of the whole Bible in a year. And then I'm also teaching to some of the more advanced students. We're doing biblical interpretation. So we're teaching them how to read the Bible and how to read it well and consistently, and how they apply it. Now, I began teaching for the year this last Tuesday, and I was reminded of something as I got up to teach, something really important, and Mark will know exactly what I'm talking about. The new kid. See, the new kid, specifically kids that have not had me as a teacher before, they don't know the rules. The kids who have me before, they know the rules, and even more importantly, they know when they can break the rules. Right? You know what I'm talking about. So, for instance, in my class, there's a rule that when I'm talking, you don't talk. If I'm lecturing and giving some sort of instruction, then you need to raise your hand and wait to be called on. But in my classes, I also do a lot of class discussion. And I don't like to have the class discussion slowed down by having students raise their hands and waited to be called on. I want it to keep going and be moving. And so the students who have had me before know that in that situation, the rule to raise their hand doesn't apply. They just have to be respectful of one another. But the new kid, he shows up and all he knows is, I've got to raise my hand in class. And suddenly he sees all of his peers promptly breaking that rule. And he knows that there's some sort of unspoken agreement between the students and myself, but he can't quite begin to figure out what that agreement is. And so he begins to test the waters a little bit. He begins to try to do things, try to figure out what it means to follow the rules, but not really follow the rules. And you know what he does? He messes up. And the other students, when he does that, goes, I can't, and he has no idea what he did wrong. And it doesn't apply just to raising your hand in class. It applies to, when to use humor, when to tell a joke, and when not to. What kind of joke to tell and what kind of joke not to. And all kinds of different things like this, in which there's rules, but sometimes those rules can be broken. And over time, the students begin to figure that out. But for a while, this new kid has no idea. And he kind of looks silly sometimes. As we read our passage for today, I want you to have that in mind. Because as I'm reading this, and I see Jesus' interaction with the Pharisees, I can't help but think that the Pharisees, and sometimes us, are kind of like the new kid. They know the rules, but they don't understand that sometimes the rules don't exactly apply. Starting in Matthew 12:1, we read, At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry and began to pick the heads of grain and eat. But when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples do what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." But he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions, how he entered the house of God and then ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priests alone? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests of the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, 'I desire compassion and not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Departing from there, he went into the synagogue. He went into their synagogue, and a man was there whose hand was withered. And they questioned Jesus, asking, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So that they might accuse him. And he said to them, "What man is there among you who has a sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will he not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable then is a man than a sheep? So then it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and it was restored to normal like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him as to how they might destroy him. Now, I want to take a little bit of time. We're going to spend our first half of this message talking about verses 1 through 8. And there's a couple of things that I want you to see from that particular section of this passage. First, I want you to observe this picture of Jesus and his disciples on the Sabbath day. They're walking through a grain field, and the disciples, they're becoming hangry. They're becoming hungry. And so they start picking the grain, and they start eating it. Now, we're told that when the Pharisees saw this, that they complained to Jesus and said, "Do you not see what they're doing? This isn't lawful. This isn't right. This isn't good. This goes against the rules for them to do this." Now, there's a couple of observations that I want to make from this passage. And the first is that the Pharisees, their objection to what the disciples were doing wasn't that they were picking the grain. See, the Bible made allowances for them to do that. If you were walking through somebody else's field, you could pick the grain and you could eat it. It was one of the ways that Israel was commanded to care for the poor and the hungry. We see this throughout the Bible, probably most famously in like the book of Ruth, in which people come and they take the grain that doesn't belong to them. That was not the objection the Pharisees were making. The problem was that they were reaping on the Sabbath. Now, there's this thing called the Mishnah Shabbat. The Mishnah Shabbat is part of something called the Talmud. And the Talmud is like the written oral tradition, the rabbinical tradition, and it kind of set the theological and law, the theology and law for Israel at this time. It was outside of the Old Testament Torah. It was just part of the Jewish tradition. And the Mishnah Shabbat outlawed 39 different things that you could not do on the Sabbath, and reaping was one of them. So the big objection that the Pharisees had is that they were reaping, they were doing work on the Sabbath that was outlawed. The second thing that I want you to notice from this is that the Pharisees, they kind of exhibit their own inability to follow their own laws. Why do I say that? Well, because it seems to me, as you read this passage, that the Pharisees were following Jesus. Now, you may not know, but in Israel at this time, Jews were only allowed to travel a certain amount on the Sabbath. That was about 1,100 meters. That is all that you were allowed to walk on the Sabbath, or it was considered work, and you couldn't do it. And yet it seems to me from this passage that the Pharisees most likely broke their own rules to go and to watch Jesus and to see what he would do. The third observation that I want to make is that when Jesus confronts them, when he answers their question, do you not see your disciples doing what is unlawful? What he does not do is he does not actually argue against the Jewish tradition. Do you notice that? He doesn't say, this is wrong. He could have come right out and said, hey, this is wrong. Instead, what he does is he appeals to a different authority to say that his disciples had the right to pick the grain on the Sabbath. Actually, I want to suggest that Jesus, he appeals to 4 different authorities to say that the disciples had that right. The first authority is he talks about King David going in, this was even before David was king, but going into the temple and eating the consecrated bread. The second he talks about the priests. Then he quotes from the prophets. And then he says, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. And so there's the 4 authorities he's talking to that he appeals to is he appeals to the king. He appeals to the priest. He appeals to the prophet. And he appeals to God himself. If you take a look at this, one of the things that you'll notice, when he talks about David, he's actually referring to, I think it's 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 6. 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 6 says, Then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, Why are you alone and no one with you? David said to Ahimelech the priest, The king has commissioned me with a matter, and he has said to me, Let no one know anything about the matter in which I am sending you, and with which I have commissioned you. And I have directed the young men to a certain place. Now, therefore, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever can be found. The priest answered David and said, There is no ordinary bread on hand, but there is consecrated bread, if only the young men have kept themselves from women. David answered the priest and said to him, Surely women have been kept from us, as previously when they set out, and the vessels of the young men were holy. Though it was an ordinary journey, how much more than today will their vessels be holy? So the priest gave him consecrated bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which was removed from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place when it was taken away. Now, if Jesus is going to appeal to an authority to say that what the disciples did by picking the grain was lawful, this is a really interesting passage for him to do. Because if you look at it, everything about this makes David seem like a very sinful man. What we know is he says to the high priest that he is on a mission for King Saul. He wasn't on a mission for King Saul. He lied to the priest. David and his men then took the consecrated bread, the bread that was set before God, and they ate it. That was something that was only lawful for the priest to do, and they were not priests. And we also know that this was the Sabbath. We know it's the Sabbath because it says that the bread of the presence was removed and replaced with hot bread on that day, which was only done on the Sabbath. So he's also violating the Sabbath. And yet when you read Jesus' words, it seems like Jesus is attributing this to him as something that was righteous. That this was a good thing for David to do. And in doing so, Jesus appeals to the king. He says, look at the authority of King David, the greatest king Israel has ever had. He violated the Sabbath. Then he turns to the priest and he says, what about the priest? To remove the consecrated bread on the Sabbath. And they're innocent when they do this. Then he quotes from the Old Testament. He says, but if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice, you would not condemn the innocent. One of the things that Jesus is doing here is he's quoting from the prophet Hosea, Hosea 6, verse 6. And he's saying, you know what? The Sabbath is not just about the rules. The Sabbath is not just about the sacrifice and all the thing that goes with it. The Sabbath is about having compassion on your fellow man. And so here we have Jesus who appeals to the authority of the king through David. He appeals to the priesthood, and he appeals to the prophet. And then finally he follows it up and says, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. And by saying that he is the Lord of the Sabbath, he is equating himself with God. And so he appeals to 4 different authorities to claim that he has the authority to allow his disciples to break the Sabbath law. It's really interesting. Right after Jesus talks about the priests and how they, by exchanging the consecrated bread, that they are breaking the Sabbath law, and yet they are still innocent, Jesus says in verse 6, but I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. Now, that's a really interesting statement for him to say. Something greater than the temple is here. In this verse, this temple stands as a symbol for the priesthood. Jesus is saying, you know, the priests, they have the authority to violate the temple or to violate the Sabbath, but something even greater than them is here. And if you think that I'm stretching that a little bit, you need to look a little bit further into Matthew chapter 12. Verses 41 through 42 says, the men of Nineveh will stand up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And behold, something greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, something that's greater than Solomon is here. Let me ask you something. Who was Jonah? He was a prophet. Who was Solomon? He's a king. And so 3 times in Matthew chapter 12, he says, I am greater. I am greater because I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I am greater than the king in his authority. I am greater than the priest in his authority, and I am greater than the prophet in his authority. Because I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I get to choose. And people come first. Following all of that, we go on to verses 9 through 14, and we get this incredible picture of the Pharisees. It says Jesus went to their synagogue. Has anybody noticed that it doesn't say he went to the synagogue? It says he went to their synagogue. Something that I want you to understand about this is Jesus is actually using terminology that we see the prophets use throughout the Old Testament. Whenever the prophets are trying to tell Israel that they are outside of the covenant relationship with God, when they have violated God's law, they will often distinguish themselves from the people of Israel by talking about their synagogue. Or we'll talk about them as being separated and outside of the covenant with God. Now, one of the interesting things about the book of Matthew is that it was written to a Jewish audience. It was written to appeal to the Jews. The Jews that were reading this would have understood how critical Matthew was throughout the entire book because they had failed to recognize the Messiah. And they would have understood when Jesus talks about going to their synagogue, they would have understood just how deeply the Pharisees misunderstood the Sabbath. That they totally missed the point. And it says that Jesus went to their synagogue, and the Pharisees wanted to catch him. They wanted to basically frame him and have a reason to go after him. And they asked him, is it lawful for you to heal this man on the Sabbath? Now, this assumes a couple of different things. This is a really interesting question for them to ask. Because the first thing that it assumes is that they're asking, can you heal on the Sabbath? Now, customarily, you could heal someone on the Sabbath in a life and death emergency. That was understood under Jewish law. But the thing about this situation, when you have the man with the withered hand, the fact that that hand was withered seems to indicate that this was a lifelong or a long-term injury or disease. And so when they asked that, it doesn't seem like this would appeal to that exception to the rule, does it? Because it's not an immediate need. The other thing their question assumes is it assumes that Jesus has the ability to heal it. They're kind of indirectly acknowledging Jesus' power. And that's a really cool thing. Now, Jesus responds to them by saying, which one of you, if you had a sheep and it falls into a pit, would you not get it? Would you not rescue it? How much more valuable is man than that animal? Now, the interesting thing about both the man with the withered hand and this rhetorical sheep that Jesus talks about is that in either situation, there is not an immediate need to get them out. There's no indication that the sheep that fell into a pit, that this was an emergency situation. That it couldn't have waited until after the Sabbath, just like the man. And yet Jesus says, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. In doing so, Jesus is actually pointing out their own hypocrisy. He's saying, you would rescue the sheep, which violates your own rules, but you won't help this man. How much more valuable is man than an animal, and you won't do it? It's kind of an amazing thing that they would put an animal, a piece of property, above the well-being of their fellow Israelite. And yet they do it. And Jesus calls them out on that. I want you to notice one last thing about this. When Jesus says it's good to do this, you'll notice that he says it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. He does not say it's right to do good on the Sabbath. He says it's lawful. Now, that might not seem like a very big distinction, but it's huge. Why? Because when Jesus says it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath, what he is saying is that when you see somebody in need, you can help them without violating the Sabbath. It is okay to do this. But when Jesus said it is right to do good on the Sabbath, then that becomes like a moral obligation that you have, right? Now, let me ask you something. If you go home today, how many people are you going to pass on your way home that have some sort of a need that you could meet? If Jesus says it was right to do good on the Sabbath, you would have a moral obligation to meet every single one of those needs. And the reality of it is, not even Jesus met every single need that he came across. It's not realistic. But Jesus says it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. I think what Jesus is saying is he is opening up the door for us to listen to his guidance, to listen to the Holy Spirit, to guide us to know when we need to intervene and when we don't need to. Does that make sense? We spent a lot of time over the last, 2 months or so talking about the Sabbath, haven't we? I had to kind of laugh when I saw what the passage for this weekend was, because I'm like, oh, the Sabbath again. Awesome. One of the things that we have often asked, even a week ago in my apartment, is the question, what can I do on the Sabbath and what can't I do? We're a people who really, really like rules. And rules are good. Those rules about the Sabbath, they put some guidelines there that help us to keep it, to serve God. But we have to understand when the rules are meant to be broken. We have to remember that Jesus said, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. I desire compassion more than sacrifice. Don't be the new kid. Don't be so stuck on the rules, trying to figure out what it is he's supposed to do and what he's not. Know the teacher. And when you know the teacher, you know when the rules can bend and when the rules can break. Let's pray.